In previous videos, we saw where you can find information about gathered items or the status of triggers and events, but that doesn't help you to get a good overview of what's going on in your network. In this video, let me show you how to create your own web pages that contain the information you want to see at a glance. Zabbix calls these web pages screens. You can fill them with different kinds of widgets that show certain information. Let's go to Configuration Screens. As you see, there is a default screen that comes pre-configured with Zabbix. When I click on the screen's name, I'm taken to the screen editor. A screen is basically a table that consists of a configurable number of rows and columns. You can add widgets to each of the table's cells. The widget up here is an existing map that was just included. This widget spans 2 columns. To edit the widget, I can click on Change and, instead of the map, I now see the settings of the map widget. For example, I could choose another map. Or I could choose an entirely different widget like a data overview. I can align this widget horizontally or vertically within the table. And you see here that the widget is spanning 2 columns. The other 2 widgets down here are 2 graphs showing the CPU load and the CPU utilization of the Zabbix server by including the pre-configured graphs. To create a new screen, click on the Create Screen button at the top right. I can enter a name for the screen like Example Screen, and I can enter the number of rows and columns I want to start with. This doesn't really matter because I can add rows and columns easily in the editor. When I click on Save, the new empty screen is created. To rename the screen, I can click on the Edit link on the right. When I click on the screen's name on the left instead, I'm taken to the screen editor. So this is a 1x1 table with space for just one widget. To make it a 2x2 table, I click on the plus icon here to add a column and the plus icon here to add a row. I can also click on the minus sign to remove them again. Now when I click on Change, I'm asked what kind of widget I would like to create. The fields below the selection box depend on the kind of widget. For example, for a graph, I need to choose the respective graph, like the CPU load on the server Fry. I can change the width and height of the plotting area of the graph, so let me set it to 800 pixels wide and 100 pixels high. I can change the alignment within the row or column, or I can make the widget span several rows or columns. The dynamic item checkbox is an interesting feature. If you enable it, this screen can be used for different hosts. When you view the screen later, all pre-configured graphs, simple graphs, or values shown in the plain text widget are shown for the respective host. So you can create one screen for all computers if you want to see certain aspects instead of creating the same screen over and over again for multiple hosts. Now when I click on Save, the widget is displayed with the new settings. I can also drag this widget to another location in the table by holding the mouse button and moving the widget to another location. Now let me give you a quick overview of the different kinds of widgets that are available. The Data Overview shows a table of all latest data of the items for the hosts in a certain host group. You can configure it to show the hosts on the left or at the top. You cannot limit, though, which items you want to see, so this widget is usually pretty large. The Graph widget lets you embed a graph that you configured for a certain host or template. You can use your mouse as usual to display a certain time range and zoom in with your mouse, just in the way you're working with graphs normally. This gets really interesting if you use multiple graphs on the same screen, because the filtered time range applies to all graphs. That way you can look at certain time windows and find out how different values looked at that time. The history of action widgets show which actions Zabbix has run recently, like running remote commands or sending alert messages to users. This widget can also occupy a lot of space and may rarely be useful. A more common widget is the history of events. This is a view that I almost always include in screens because it shows you what happened recently. The host info widget is rather simple. It just counts how many hosts in a given host group are available, unavailable, or whose status is unknown. The map widget lets you include a pre-configured map like this one. Plain text is a widget that shows recent values of a given item in a simple table. You can set how many values you want to display at once. The Screen widget lets you include another screen. This lets you nest one screen into another. So in this example, I'm using the screen that Zabbix creates by default. The server overview widgets show the status of the Zabbix server in a simple table. This information is similar to what you find on the dashboard. Using the Simple Graph widget, you can add an ad hoc graph for any existing item. You don't need to configure a graph manually before using this widget. And just like with a graph widget, you can filter the visible time period and zoom into time ranges by selecting them with your mouse. The widget called Status of Host Groups Triggers shows the trigger status of a host in a given host group. In this example, I'm displaying the problems that Zabbix has found with my web servers. A similar widget is called Status of Host Triggers that shows the triggers of a single host instead of a host group. The System Status widget gives us a table that counts how many systems in the various host groups have problems of which severity. The Triggers Info widget is even simpler and groups that information for all host groups in an even simpler table. The Triggers Overview widget gives me a table of all triggers of the hosts of a certain host group. And this is similar to the overview page you get in the monitoring section. And finally, the URL widget creates an iframe that lets you embed a web page from a given URL at this place. In this example, I have added the Zabbix documentation page to this frame. And as you see, the frame reloads its contents automatically. So much for the available widgets you can place on your own screens. In the next video about maps, I will show you another nice feature of Zabbix that lets you customize views in another way that is slightly more graphical and even more powerful.